On the podcast today, we are going to speak about chapter 72 of the Tao Te Ching, which makes up the 72nd episode of the 81 meditations on the Tao Te Ching. And as usual, Guyang will read Jia Fu Feng and Jane English's translation, and I will read Derek Lin's translation.
When people lack a sense of awe, there will be disaster. Do not intrude into their homes. Do not harass them at work. If you do not interfere, they will not weary of you. Therefore the wise know themselves, but make no show. Have self-respect, but are not arrogant. They let go of that and choose this.
When people no longer fear force, they bring about greater force. Do not limit their place. Do not reject their livelihood, because the ruler does not reject them. Therefore they do not reject the ruler. Therefore the sages know themselves, but do not glorify themselves. Respect themselves, but do not praise themselves. Thus they discard that and take this. Once again, in this chapter, Lao Tzu is returning back to leadership and a ruler. Hence, he lived through the Warring States period of China. So obviously, it was a tricky situation, and there were many philosophies floating around at that time, and Lao Tzu did have his own view on leadership, as we've discussed on other chapters throughout this series. And so this chapter is more so about, it is about leadership obviously, but it's about the relationship between the common people and the ruler themselves. And so how a wise ruler treats the people as opposed to how an ignorant ruler treats the people.
Yes. In this chapter, it's almost like telling the rulers to not to intrude into their homes, not to harass them at work, and not to interfere these people. So we can relate that part, right? Like intrude into their homes with their authority and power, and harass them at work. Sometimes we get harassed by our bosses sometimes, right?
That's right, yeah.
We can relate in that sense as well. And yeah, the very first line, he talks about the sense of awe, right? When people lack of sense of awe, there will be disaster. And some people translate this awe as in a fear of a ruler, or people should be frightened of the authority. But I think Lao Tzu is not exactly talking about the fear factor here. I think it's more kind of a sense of awe as in what leaders should have as a charismatic power type of thing. We mentioned earlier chapters about charismatic powers of the sages or the leaders, right? The ones who follow the way of nature, way of Tao, sincerely, then those ones will naturally have that kind of charismatic power, kind of a sense of awe, right? So it's not necessarily that people will be fearful of those rulers. It's more like they have respect, in a sense, respect and feel their charisma, so that they kind of becoming good followers of that Taoist ruler, you could say.
Yeah, it's a good point. Edward Slingland translates "de" as charismatic power in one way. So, and what he speaks about in Trying Not to Try, his book, is like that charismatic power, which is kind of like the spirit or the shen of the individual sort of glow, or it kind of draws people to that, that sort of charismatic power. And from his perspective, that's what de is. So like the ruler needs this charismatic power, in an ideal world, right? And we often don't get that, throughout history, as we know. But that's where the people can trust the ruler, because they have that charismatic power, but there's also what drives that is this authenticity, this genuineness, where the people can trust and respect that ruler. And we, like I said, we don't often get that, right? And I like in Jia Fu Feng and Jane English's translation, like intruder in the people's homes. Think about it in this way, right? Like where you have the television or you have social media telling you how to be and how to think and so forth and so on, and it's usually coming from the government, in air quotes, or the companies that fund the government. And so they want you to think a certain way and be a certain way. And, I like in relation to that translation, that idea. And it highlights, a lot of the flaws with a lot of modern politicians who follow certain ideologies, who want to take away from the people things like their inalienable right for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so forth and so on, right? And so when you see politicians like this, it makes it hard for the people to trust those people, because they are intruding in their livelihood, in their house. They're telling them that they need to speak a certain way, and they make up all sorts of excuses as to why someone should speak a certain way, right? And why they want to destroy freedom of speech. And they make up all of these things like reasons to get rid of freedom of speech, right? But monitoring speech is one of the reasons that led to communism and is Marxist thought, right? And so Taoism doesn't adapt to that, as we see in China. And so Taoism is its own thing, but it adapts more to democracy in that sense of freedom of speech and being able to think and do as you please. Because, first of all, a lot of innovation and creativity comes from a society like that, as opposed to a very restricted society. It's hard to even progress spiritually in a lot of sense. And so Lao Tzu is very wary in this chapter about that type of dictatorship that can happen, and all of these fake excuses to get rid of things such as freedom of speech, right? And so it's unfortunate that social media is training the younger generations to be more overly sensitive, more soft, and so forth and so on. And so they can't hear things that are outside their own subjective experience. When our generation and older, people said mean things all the time. Mm-hmm. But how do you determine what a mean thing is? That's determined by your own subjective experience, right? And so it's actually part of maturing and spiritual growth when you can listen to things that are outside your purview and that are mean, but it doesn't bother you anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was what the whole point of being able to say what you want in society was for, because it helps the society grow and mature, and sometimes bad ideas get thrown out and so forth and so on, right? So it's a no-brainer, but as Lao Tzu is alluding to in this chapter, not only in our day and age, but in his day and age, people often fell for sometimes the rulers who were trying to control them and have sort of this totalitarianism over them.
Yes, how Lao Tzu always warned the leaders especially not to interfere with the people and the society, right? And the interfere, in other words, you could say the control, right? Because control is a sense of interfering with the people's lives, or just how things are, or there's a natural order in the society, right? But you want to interject that natural order, and you want to control to serve your own agenda or your own benefits, right? So yeah, the rulers have to really cautious about, and nowadays they don't really care about it at all. Obviously, you pointed out that they like to tell how to think, how to vote, and how to, speak. Even the extreme sense of control is coming over to censorship. It's not only censorship as in, what to do and what not to do. It's more how we should think and behave and whatnot. It's total control, almost So it's very worrying signs that's appearing these days. And you mentioned earlier about the communist political ideology over democracy. And yes, definitely Taoist way is leaning more towards democracy. There is a big difference between democracy and communist or Marxist ideology. The difference is the trust. So democracy is based on trusting human nature, the trusting that human behave in a right way in a certain circumstance, right? But communism or Marxism, because they don't trust people's human nature, so that they need to have a lot more control and interfere with the individual's life, right? And then by that stage, individuals don't have any right, basically. They've given up all the rights to government, basically, because there is no trust in the human nature. That's huge difference. So Lao Tzu always emphasized how lived things are, right? And through this chapter is showing that you need to trust that the way of nature. So let way of nature just fix things itself. And we know from our own life experience, right? Sometimes when you try to fix more and more, things go wrong. But when you just leave things alone, things just kind of get sorted out itself, right? And meanwhile, you get to kind of collect your thoughts, and the things become clearer, and just the way things are. And the bigger scale in a, ruling a nation is almost the same way. Even more, you need to kind of step back, right? And lead from behind. Like in this chapter again, Lao Tzu trying to teach to these leaders, not only leaders, and also to the individuals as well.
In relation to what you were saying about China and communism, Marxism and Taoism and control, that's why Confucianism adapts to communism very well, because of that controlling aspect of controlling every little thing you do, down to how you sleep and how women bind their feet and so forth and so on. And so that's why in China you had kind of the death of Buddhism and Taoism, though they still exist in China, but they're pretty much in the faraway background, where Confucianism is still at the forefront of the cognitive style of China, and let's say East Asia in general, Japan and Korea as well. And so it just adapts so well to communism and Marxism, and that's why it survives, and because of that controlling aspect, right? Like where Taoism is liberating people from those constraints, as you said, and telling you that human beings are not beasts from birth, where communism and Confucianism have a mentality that we are beasts from birth. And so they don't trust human nature, and hence want to superimpose this ideology and philosophy onto the people, where Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, for example, are trying to free people from that mentality and free people from those ideologies and so forth and so on, which sadly, in the last few years, we've seen certain toxic ideologies, particularly in the West, being superimposed on the people. And if you don't follow them, then you're censored and so forth and so on. So you've got these large tech companies and investment firms controlling the thought space and forcing good and decent people to fall in line with a certain type of thinking, where you just need to reject that altogether. Because, first of all, human nature will prevail. Those companies and that can try and forge whatever sort of idiotic ideology onto the people and accept good and decent people to accept it. But that type of ideology only really exists in certain parts in the West. You go to India, you go to the Middle East and this and that. Those ideologies don't exist, not even in Russia. And so you have to be very cognizant of when a culture is trying to force you to think a certain way and trying to censor you in a certain way if you don't follow that, right? You have to be a mature individual, stand up for yourself and for your own nature, and you don't have to accept those things. Because if they're interfering with people's lives, this is not the path of Wu Wei. The path of Wu Wei is the path of non-interference. And as we've discussed all through the series, all of these leadership chapters that Lao Tzu talks about is trying to convince the ruler, as you were saying, that the path of non-interference is the way forward for humanity, because that's how you allow people to think as they will, create what they will. That's how actually you bring the de out of individual. How do you bring the virtue out of an individual, that de, right? And when I say de here, we use the river analogy, where when you're fighting the current or you're holding onto the banks of the river, you will drown in the Tao, right? Whereas if you let go of the banks or you just stop fighting the current, the river's power becomes your power. That's the unobstructed Tao moving through you. Yes. And so that can't move through you if you live in a certain space or society or this and that, where you're restricted all the time in how you think and how you live and so forth and so on, right? Imagine, this is the problem with the modern day, right? Because of the last few years, particularly since the pandemic, where all of this censorship went all bananas and people even policing each other online and stuff, like crazy stuff, right? Where the big problem with this is when you start to censor yourself in your own mind, right? I can't say a certain thing because they've created this fake thing that they determine as hate speech, and hate speech according to who, and that's what they create to try and destroy freedom of speech, because we don't want to hear mean things. No one's ever said a mean thing in the world before, have they? And it's like, yes, they have. People say mean things all the time, but the thing is, they're words. They only have intrinsic value to you if you identify so much with them. So the path of Taoism is the path of getting rid of all of these associations, right? And so when you start censoring yourself in your mind, that's when you're gone. And that's actually what these type of rulers want you to do, the ones who don't follow the path of Wu Wei. They put a certain template out there for the people, and they sort of know human nature is that if everyone else starts to follow it, right, everyone else thinks, oh, well, this is what it is now, things change, and there's this very sheeple mentality, right? And then so they take that on, and then they start to censor themselves, and then they don't speak their mind. Then they can't be authentic and genuine. And so you fundamentally destroy society from within the individual, and it festers out into the collective. And so Lao Tzu is warning us against that, telling us on an individual level to continue to follow the path of Wu Wei. We aren't beasts from birth. We can trust each other. We can trust the universe. The universe has its way. But we also need to be cognizant of the figures of authority that we give our power away to. Are they in a good relationship with the people, or are they trying to tell people how to think and how to be? Mm-hmm. That's the questions that we need to ask ourselves.
Yes. This nowadays around the world, this new extreme liberal regime or the ideologies going around the world, and as you mentioned, with extreme censorship and how you speak, and like hate speech and that kind of absurd terms going around, and as if they're trying to promote there is something like ideal world, so to speak, as an ideal world that everyone mind their own matters and using kind words to everyone and this and that. And that is actually very like extreme liberalistic way of thinking, because we all know that is kind of come from deluded mind. So that do we need to leave this, let's say, world ugly as it is, let's say. But that ugliness is let's not say that's a bad or good or bad or anything like that. That's just a part of nature. Like in the forest, is there a such thing as a order when you measure with a ruler or something like that?
No.
There's no such thing. There is no that ideal paradise, ideal world that these extreme liberal people think or talking about to create. There is no such thing, right? As things are, as Lao Tzu always emphasize, as the nature, the order as it is already perfect. So what they're trying to do is, we have to say that's just a propaganda. It's just a kind of tool to control people. And again, like you said about the hate speech and this and that, according to who? Really, it's all subjective.
Yeah.
So you can say what you're thinking is right, but the other person can say what they think is right as well. And it's completely subjective. And that's why where this morality issue, in the end, gets thrown out the bin, really, because there's no such thing as absolute morality. It's all subjectivity, based on subjectivity, and it's relative too. Every society has different custom, different tradition and culture, so that the rules apply differently, and that's just how things are. There's no such thing as this ideal paradise that everyone gets along. Everyone sometimes don't get along. Something wrong with it? Absolutely not, because that's how things are. And we need to be able to accept it. And this, the extreme left, the parties and politicians trying to promote is just a complete absurdity, because that's only to, again, control us. and but we need to be like a very smart and alert about it, and that's important.
And in saying that, you will have triggered thousands of those in saying that obvious, honest statement, right? And it's not that we support some other party. Like people get so triggered by this and that, right? Like, for example, you say that and it's like, oh, well, so the conservative parties don't have problems. Of course they do. Plenty of problems. Taoism's outside both ways of thinking. It's not an either-or scenario here, but like your statement was saying, is that it's those extreme liberal views that are trying to force things on people and are not following the path of Wu Wei. That's just a fact of the matter now. If you can't deal with that, then, well, that's on you. And first of all, you need to understand what the term liberal means. A classical liberal is completely different than what it has become in the modern day. Like from when I knew liberalism in the 90s to what it is now, it's completely different. I don't even know what it is. And I don't know how it became like that, because it is communism. That's what it is. It is riddled with postmodernist Marxist ideology. And so you need to understand that if you want to follow Taoist thought, because those type of ideologies are openly, as you said, trying to force an opinion on people or a perspective and an ideology on people, and you ought to follow it or we will cancel your bank account, as we found in Canada, right? So that's to the degree that it goes to. Imagine people getting their bank accounts cancelled because they just don't agree with the status quo. I mean, that seems like something beyond communism.
Totalitarianism.
Yeah, totalitarianism, exactly. And so it's not because there are people that watch the podcast, they get triggered when we mention these things because they are radical leftists and this and that. And you and I don't have a political leaning, so we can openly speak about this because we're speaking about from the Taoist perspective. And so if it's not following the path of Wu Wei, then it's on that and on you for not recognizing that, instead of supporting your political ideology, which may mean that you're more political than spiritual, right? And I like what you said about subjective ideals, right? So an ideal world from a subjective perspective. Think about it this way. What's the ideal world for a gazelle? So the ideal world for a gazelle is to forage the nature, the plants, eat all the grass on the savannah, and not get eaten by a lion.
Yeah, no predators.
No predators. But what's the ideal world for a lion? To eat a gazelle.
Full of gazelles everywhere.
Because, I'm speaking to what your point was about, like in the forest, right? So human beings, because of this moral tendency we have, where we think we can create this utopia, this ideal world, which is completely fake, as we just alluded to, is you're never going to make it. Because based on who and based on what. And as I mentioned in many of my books, whose morality is right, even on a human level, right? So we constantly have to come back to that type of thinking, is that, when we say an ideal world, what do you mean by an ideal world? From the perspective of the lion or from the perspective of the gazelle? And so we constantly have to remind ourselves that that ideal world doesn't exist. And so can we accept that it doesn't exist, right? So a lot of communist ideas, for example, Marxist ideas are around equality, that everything is equal and this and that. But as we mentioned with the gazelle and the lion analogy, it depends on what you mean. Because, obviously it's not equal in the sense that because the gazelle can't kill a lion. It's just, I can't beat Michael Jordan in a game of basketball. I'm not going to sit around and cry and whine about it. It's just a fact of the matter. You know what I mean? It's a fact of the matter. And I think that what a lot of these ideologies do is they take the fact of the matter out of it and try to superimpose this fake reality that everything is equal in nature and this and that. And it's not. This is based on our own moral tendencies. And we think that our moral tendencies supersede nature, but as we've said in the podcast time and time again, nature will always prevail. It always prevails. I can convince myself all day long that I'm going to dunk over Michael Jordan and win the game. Ain't going to happen. He's just going to swat it and say, get out of my kitchen, you know what I mean? And that's it. And so, the world's become so bananas that we can't accept the way reality actually is. And when you and I grew up, and even older generations, we all knew how life was. And we accepted it, and it was actually, it's fun and it's cool when you understand that, because there's certain idiosyncrasies and certain things that you know about people, yourself, society, and so forth and so on, that actually makes the world beautiful. When you try to just have this mentality that the whole table is clean and it's all the same and we all think the same and we are the same, in air quotes, this is what leads to this collective psychopathy that we are that we have seen in the last, say, 4 to 6 years recently.
So in the end, the regime itself is aimed to destroy individuality, right? To destroy the individual voice and the right, of course. So this extreme censorship is actually actualizing in our society, which is it's everywhere, but I don't think people are aware and people accepting the wrong things, really, right? Like you said, that we need to practice, in a sense, the radical acceptance in a way that we are not equal, right? But that it's why the world is running fine, right? Because we are good at different things. Everyone has a different skill sets, right? Can you imagine if literally everyone was the same, if everyone was, so to say, equal? Then society will be like, I don't know, everyone might be good at just the one thing, not the other, so things will not run properly.
Why
right?
live?
Yeah, exactly. So it'll be pretty boring life, right? We like to hang out with friends and family because we like to exchange different thoughts and opinions, right? Because we are different. So in that sense, we need to accept how we are different and unequal.
And the radical Taoist doesn't follow politically correct lines. Lao Tzu is politically incorrect. Zhuangzi is extremely politically incorrect. And so we have to have that mentality. If you want to be the best version of yourself and express your own li, your own organic pattern, there's a word in Chinese called li, and your de drives that, your virtue drives that li. And as I said, once you let go of all of these ideas, you let go of the tyranny around you, you let go of even policing your own mind, then your own organic pattern can shine into the world. And this leads to yin, and yin is like this mutual resonance, harmonic resonance and mutual interdependence, which gravitates, brings people towards you. That may be in that charismatic way, that may be in a creative way, or in a way where people are like, I like the cut of that guy's jib, you know what I mean? He's not bad. And so as a Taoist or a spiritual aspirant, you want to go down that path. You don't want to follow politically correct lines and so forth and so on. I remember once, a few years ago, Quentin Tarantino was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and Quentin is obviously not politically correct. Hence, he makes some of the best films in the industry. And Joe mentioned something in that vein, because Quentin was saying how the 90s became less politically correct as what the 80s were, and so forth and so on. And so that kind of, allowed more creativity and everything like that. Obviously, it reverted back after the 2000s and, went bananas. But Joe was sort of saying, like, how do you do it, like, and he's like, why would I care what's politically correct? And that needs to be our mentality. You just don't need to care. If someone doesn't like you because you don't think as they do, that's on them, not on you. The whole idea of allowing the Tao to express itself through you is exactly in allowing it to express itself through you, not in you expressing the voice of whatever the politically correct narrative is around you. You need to allow the Tao to move through you and express itself as it is. And if that offends someone, that's on them. You don't need to worry about it. You can't go around your whole life worrying about if you're going to offend somebody. Obviously, you don't want to be a complete damn fool and just, be abusing everyone here and there. But like a sane and normal individual is not going to do that, right? But you're going to feel that sense of the Tao moving through you. You're going to acknowledge that and honor that and then express what it has to give the world through you. You're a channel for the Tao to express itself, right? You are an aperture for that. But you cannot allow the Tao to move through if you've got all of these things in your mind that are like a dam in the river. You can't express yourself freely, right? And so you just can't fall in line with that. As I said, Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu are not politically correct. And if that offends people, then that's just the way it is. They don't follow this Western hyper-compassion that has been superimposed onto Buddhism, unfortunately, that we see in the West, where, particularly in America, where Buddhism is completely destroyed and has become a political mouthpiece and about ultra-compassion, again, a subjective version of compassion, which is not based on the teachings of the Buddha, not found in the Nikayas, the original teachings of the Buddha, not found in other teachings later on in early Buddhism, but because we see it a certain way, we're going to say that this is what Buddhism is about. It's just about morality based on our own subjective perspective and our own political leaning, and it's about compassion based on our own subjective experience and our own political leaning. And it's like, well, that's not actually what Buddhism is. That's a political philosophy. And so Taoism should, and in its essence, never fall for that because it doesn't have any of that in it. Buddhism shouldn't have either. And it's not like that outside of the Western dynamic. But that's important for a lot of us to remember, is that you don't want to fall into this following the herd mentality of that we need to follow whatever is politically correct. We need to keep up with the Joneses of whatever moral is. And the moral goalposts and the politically correct goalposts keep moving. And so it was this one year, it's that the next year. It's hard to keep up, right? And so you know how you don't even try? You just jump off the field, follow your own innate nature, allow the Tao to express itself.
Yeah, that's right. You need to just observe from a distance, and you don't jump into any of those leanings.
No.
And you just keep your position firmly.
That's right. And so that's how we should measure our leaders. We should measure our leaders if they are muzzled by political correctness, if they are muzzled by the tech companies, the investment firms that usually control a lot of political parties and a lot of the ideological space, especially on social media and so forth and so on. We need to question that. And we need to look at the leaders who take care of the average person, don't use the current ideologies to measure how people should behave in society, just basing it just on just pure common sense about do people have food, clothing and shelter, the simple needs. We're not talking about someone's differences, we're talking about how people are similar and judging it. And so usually the leader who follows Wu Wei is the one who exhibits those traits, and they're the ones that we can trust, and that's how society moves forward, because the society in itself is sort of reflected into the leader's mind. They want to do what is best for the people from behind, as we've spoke about in many chapters, leading from behind with that humility. So guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.